just to boil this thing down, I think that the idea that the good is the enemy of the perfect, which was essentially the sentiment, and I don't want to make this whole thing into picking on Susan Sarandon, because I think that her message, 95% of her message I totally agree with, and she is such a passionate campaigner and a real progressive hero, in addition to being a brilliant actor. And I have absolute and total and tremendous respect for her. That said, the idea that Donald Trump will somehow activate, the revolution, what can he do that's worse than George Bush invading Iraq and then declaring mission impossible and then having people die and after, time after time after time? What could he do that's worse than the obstruction that we've seen of President Obama? I mean, some really good legislation that when the Democrats held the House and the Senate, some really good legislation came out of the House. But they only had that veto-proof majority for 71 or 74 business days or legislative days. And then what was it? Scott Brown got sworn in, as I recall, that put an end to that and to replace Ted Kennedy. And then it was all filibusters all the time, all Republican filibusters all the time. And that didn't produce the revolution. I mean, you've got $1.4 trillion in student debt. It hasn't produced a revolution. You've got hundreds of thousands of people whose homes are underwater because of crimes committed by the banksters that the banksters are completely unpunished for. I would say in large part because of the massive campaign contributions they've been giving to politicians of both parties. And that hasn't produced the revolution. So, destroying America's name around the world by having, a narcissist like Donald Trump in the White House. And there's little doubt in my mind that he would be moderated by the people around him. I think that the Reagan presidency is probably a reasonably good example of that. Ronald Reagan, took long naps every day. He took more and longer vacations than any president in the history of the United States. Until George W. Bush. Actually, George W. Bush beat Reagan's record, at least in 1 year. I think it was his first year in 2001. And but Reagan, Bush Senior rather, kind of ran the White House, and of course Reagan was in pretty full blown dementia the last couple of years of his presidency. And Bush was running the show, and he had good advisors in the Pentagon and all this kind of stuff. So, the idea of Donald Trump running around with a nuclear football. Joe Madison was on my TV show last night, and he was talking about how, that's a scary idea, and I absolutely agree. I mean, Joe nailed the most perfect meme, right? The image that we all should be thinking about. Donald Trump with the nuclear football, really. But that said, I don't think that a Trump presidency any more than, look at the insane amount of damage that Rick Snyder has done to Michigan. Look at the damage that Sam Brownback has done to Kansas. He's devastated that state. Look at what Bobby Jindal did to Louisiana. And you got John Bel Edwards now, who's the new Democratic governor, inheriting a mind-boggling mess in every single one of these cases. Look at the damage that John Kasich has done to Ohio. We've gone through the list before. We'll do it again. I mean, in fact, I want to get Congressman Tim Ryan on the radio show here to tell you about it, because he's from Ohio and he's got the list. But none of these things, or look at what Rick what's his name has done down in Florida, Rick Scott. I get all my Ricks mixed up. So I just don't think that the revolution comes that way. I think the revolution comes at the ballot box. Now, that might mean, and I've heard this argument made, that, if you don't get the progressive candidate you want, EI, Bernie, then, you wait until 2020. I think that's a stupid argument, too. Or at least not a wise argument, shall we say. But the rationale for it is, well, you look at 1976 on the Republican side, and Reagan was running for president, as a movement candidate. And the conservative movement had grown considerably, and it was largely in a backlash movement. And it was just, I would argue, very much like, the modern progressive movement is a backlash movement. It's a backlash movement to inequality and the concentration of wealth and power in our society. In the 70s and 76, the Reagan movement was a backlash against hippies and gay people and people of color and whatnot, demanding equal rights and a place at the table and et cetera. So in both cases, and then 4 years later, Reagan came back in 1980 and claimed the presidency. And so there's this argument being made, well, maybe if Donald Trump is president for 4 years, Americans will get so disgusted, like they were with Jimmy Carter, that they'll elect, a good progressive in 2020. This is insanely dangerous, and it's also ahistorical. Ronald Reagan didn't win the election in 1980. Because he was the movement candidate. He won the election because he had cut a deal with the Ayatollah to hold the hostages. I mean, it really boils down to just that. He stole the election.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-536-2370.
Which further highlights the danger of letting any Republican into the White House, because we haven't had a legitimate Republican president since Eisenhower.
To watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.